Okay, thank you for watching the film. Hopefully you've now had a chance to sit and enjoy it and finish watching and enjoying the final Whare Vata from a wonderful woman, sung by a woman called Nan McKinnon, who is from Butter. But today, as part of this Q&A, is sort of an extra feature here as part of the release, that we wanted to discuss the underpinning research of the film. So some of you may be aware the film it stems from academia, and myself, I'm a lecturer at Newcastle University, and I've got Magnus with me, who's the film's co-producer, and who also led the underpinning research of the film, and is a specialist and an anthropologist in Gaelic and the fishing. But I'll let him introduce himself. But what we're going to do for sort of 15 and 20 minutes is introduce you to a bit of the underpinning research and discuss how that related and the film evolved from that.
Well, just to reiterate Al's thanks to all of you for coming along and watching the film. I hope you all really enjoyed it. As Al mentioned, I'm an anthropologist. I teach anthropology at the University of Edinburgh. I guess, I've worked in different places over my career. Spent many years working in southern Chile, in the Outer Hebrides, which led to the film you've just seen, also more recently in Italy. But I guess the thing that's really tied all of those diverse places and contexts together has been an interest in how language is tied to land. So particularly, I spent 15 years working in southern Chile with indigenous Mapuche people, really exploring how language isn't arbitrary. It's not something that it's not a transparent medium. So it can't simply be translated from one language into another. It's deeply tied to the specificities and the particularities of places and activities. And that was an interest that I carried with me to the Outer Hebrides when I started doing research there. As often is the case, it's kind of somewhat serendipitous how I ended up there. And both of my children are in Gaelic medium education here in Scotland. So I had a kind of latent interest in Gaelic, and the opportunity to work in the Hebrides in South Uist in particular came up. And I was interested in exploring this same kind of relationship, the way that language isn't arbitrary, but is tied to places and activities. So the initial research and project was about crofting, about how people are connected to the land. But I guess, as is the case with documentary filmmaking, ethnography as well has to just kind of follow the opportunities that arise. And for various reasons, I ended up having more opportunities to spend time with fishermen, to go out on fishing boats. We were lucky enough that there were a couple of people, Dol McIsaac, Angus Campbell, who were really interested in sharing their experiences of the sea, of the fishing industry. And at first, I'd assumed, like I guess lots of people do, that actually the sea is just this kind of, blank canvas, that it couldn't bear meaning and memory in the same way as the land does. So where it's, fairly obvious to us that the land around us, wherever we are on the globe, has place names and so on that people are attached to in various ways. I think we often assume that the sea is just this kind of unnamed mass, this kind of thing that absorbs history, absorbs memory. And, what you actually find going out on these boats with these guys is that the opposite's the case. The sea is incredibly rich, in the way that different fishing grounds have names that are tied to memories of historical events. All of the marks by which people navigate, that you hear mentioned in the film, these are all deeply tied to identity and memory. So I was just really interested in the way that all of those issues that I've been looking at on land in Chile and in Scotland were actually equally played out in the domain of the sea and fishing. And I think that that's something that you can write about, but it's also something that I think, you know, the richness of the maritime culture of the Hebrides is also really amenable to film, as you've just seen. And I think that's really where, you know, I already knew, well, I knew yourself, Alastair, obviously, and that's where I think we started talking about the possibilities of bringing those kind of insights, that knowledge into a visual medium.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was, I mean, so Magnus approached me and was telling me about his research, and it was this myself, I make films about language, you know, and I've similar to Magnus, my background's in linguistic anthropology, but I've also got a real, you know, keenness and understanding that documentary film brings something really interesting to subjects that engage with language and social norms and language and society. And this was you know, I've lived in Scotland 15 years, and this was something that was on my doorstep, but also something that I think raised some really interesting questions around, you know, the role of minority languages, or a smaller language as Gaelic is, but also how that is, you know, used. And I suppose maybe you could explain a little bit about what your research found, because I should say that Magnus did, you know, extensive ethnography before we started the film. And we made a short film together as well in the development of this film, which we can talk a little bit about later. But before that, I suppose your ethnography with the fishermen in South Uist. I mean, what were the findings as much from there about, especially in relation to the relationship between Gaelic and fishing itself?
I mean, I think really what that research did was to join the dots between two things that were actually already quite well established. So on the one hand, you know, there's been a lot of research about the Gaelic language in Scotland, you know, issues about whether it's, you know, in decline, whether it's re-emerging. There's a whole kind of you know, quite heated debate about that, but interest in kind of sociolinguistic studies of the Gaelic language, of how it's, you know, transmitted, how it's learned, and so on the one hand. And then on the other hand, there's obviously a lot of research looking at the fishing industry in Scotland, issues of conservation, the marine environment, and so on. But the strange thing was that these two issues hadn't really been brought into dialogue with one another. And actually, over the course of my research, it became evident how closely linked together these two things were. So really, you know, I don't think it's an understatement to say that in a lot of these communities in the Outer Hebrides, that the vitality, the vibrancy of the Gaelic language is tied to the fishing industry. You know, Gaelic is still very much a used language in inshore fishing. So there's really a sense in which Gaelic flourishes in fishing. The other thing that's linked to that is the fact that, you know, when you start looking at the richness of this kind of Gaelic culture of fishing, or this Gaelic engagement with the sea, you also see a commitment to sustainability. Okay, so obviously, sustainability is a key word in a lot of these debates about conservation, managing the marine environment, and so on. But what I really found was how, you know, this wasn't a new thing for these fishermen. This wasn't something that they were learning from documents and courses and legislation. This was something that was deeply, deeply ingrained in centuries old commitments to fishing as part of a holistic relationship with the sea. So, you know, things like not fishing certain fishing grounds during spawning season, the return of egg-bearing, you know, lobsters, returning undersize shellfish of various kinds to the sea. These were things that people weren't doing because they had recently come under the subject of legislation. They were doing them because they've been doing them for centuries. They've been taught to do this by their fathers, their grandfathers, and it was part of a much broader engagement with the sea and its inhabitants. So often, I mean, I think that one thing the film does well is it really challenges this stereotype that we often see in the media of, you know, the fishing industry as this kind of cutthroat business that is comprised entirely of these, you know, massive factory trawlers, which just, you know, scour the ocean beds, just, you know, collecting everything in their wake, driven solely by profit. Okay. And it's, you know, I wouldn't deny for a minute that exists. That is part of fishing in Europe and globally today. But the problem is that actually hides the majority of fishermen who tend to work on smaller inshore boats, who have a very different approach to the sea. So, you know, their knowledge about the sea isn't just limited to the target species that they're fishing for. So, you know, it's not like lobster fishermen only know about lobster, or prawn fishermen only know about prawns. They know about everything. They know about the whales and the dolphins and the porpoises. They know about the seagulls. They can tell you, you know, whether this is a 2-year-old juvenile herring gull, a 1-year-old juvenile herring gull. They just have this really, really detailed knowledge, which is part of, I keep using this word holistic, but I think it's important because it stresses that, you know, their economic engagement with the sea can't be untied from a commitment to sustainability, and a commitment to sustainability that's very much lodged in language, in their knowledge of Gaelic place names, a material culture that they can only talk about in Gaelic, and so on. So this is a kind of long-winded answer to your question, but I think what I found was something that was so obvious to the fishermen that they didn't bother making it into an explicit statement, but that is that, you know, their fishing activity, their commitment to sustainability, and their use of the Gaelic language were all intimately and inevitably tied together.
It was really striking for me as well when I was out on the boats, and obviously Magnus and I spent time early on the boats together as well, but as well as the environmental knowledge that's so bound up within the Gaelic language and their, you know, experiences on the boats. What was really striking was when I did some filming in Bada with the lifeboat crew there, and you know, they were brilliant. They were really impressive. You would have seen in the film a kind of the boat's like a Formula One car really underneath. But what was absolutely vital to that and to the Coast Guard in Stornoway was that they had a coxswain in Bada that spoke Gaelic. And that was because if there was a fisherman, and the majority of the fishermen if they get into trouble, and it happens in the seas there, for them to be able to explain where they are, how to get there, is 10 times faster if they can communicate in Gaelic, because they can explain where the landmarks are, what's going on, and you suddenly see the practical end of it as well is really fundamental, because obviously all those bays, all the locations are steeped in history and linguistically tied to the language of the place. So it was a very real kind of explanation of that they said to me, yeah, there's no choice but to have the coxswain, who's the driver of that lifeboat when they get rushed out there, and the amazing community team there had to be Gaelic speakers, because that was not only to communicate with the person there, but also to get there faster. So yeah, I mean, it was a really remarkable journey. I think for me, early on, we were spending time before we started filming for this in some ways up there, and as part of the development for the project, so to explain that Magnus was doing the ethnographic work, and we sort of felt there was an opportunity to do something filmic with the project, and to have it extend beyond the academy as well, which, you know, for academic research is always important, but for this particularly so, because it was tied to impact, and it was tied to engaging with a wider conversation at Holyrood and around and about. So we wanted to do something as well that would lead to that, and so there's a short film that Magnus and I co-directed, The English title is Our Father's Sea of that, and there is, it's a very different sort of film. BBC Alba screened it. It's won some awards with them, but it was very much directed towards, I suppose, a bit more of an impact audience. And it was a chance for us to interview the fishermen as well. So quite different to what you've just seen with Iorram, but also it gives giving voice to the current fishermen and talking about these issues that we're just talking about. So I don't know if you want to sort of explain how that, a bit about that film, and that people can go on our website and see a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, one thing I didn't mention was that when I was doing this initial research and when we were making the short film, it was in the aftermath of a quite kind of heated debate, or I suppose you could call it a row, about these marine protected areas, which is a kind of widely used designation for protecting bits of the sea. Now, what that involves varies from place to place. So some MPAs might kind of restrict all fishing, others might allow certain kinds of fishing, and so on. And there'd been a consultation, which is a legal requirement of fishermen in the Outer Hebrides, about these possible MPAs. And the fishermen understood that they had come to a kind of compromise agreement about what was possible, what wasn't possible. And then the minister in charge at the time, from a fisherman's point of view, kind of backtracked. And it seemed as though many areas that they were traditionally dependent on for fishing were going to be closed off to them. Now, one important feature of this is that under both, under UK law, under Scottish law, and this was pre-Brexit, under EU law, the cultural and linguistic values should have been taken into account in that consultation. Okay, so, minority languages have protection under EU law. So whenever there's a chance they'll be negatively impacted, that has to be taken into account in any legal consultation. That hadn't happened in the context of Scottish fishing. Okay, part of the reason for that, I think, was that the fishermen themselves and their associations, as I mentioned before, they took this relationship with Gaelic for granted. They didn't really realize its legal and political salience. So one of the goals of this short film was simply to make that point, right? That these are speakers of a minority language. That minority language is very much relevant to their fishing practice. It's tied to a fishing practice which the health of stocks around the Outer Hebrides show is effective. And that point hadn't really been made before. So we were able to take that film, because that first film was a short film, it's easy enough to persuade. We got the MSP, Alastair Allen, we got the MP, Angus Brendan McNeil, we got them to watch this film. But also importantly, people in the Outer Hebrides themselves, we did showings throughout the Outer Hebrides, and even, people from those communities, people, born and raised Gaelic speakers, weren't necessarily aware of all these issues. So again, it was a case of really joining the dots, but in this case, joining policy dots and making it clear that, the political and legal apparatuses had an obligation to acknowledge and take into account the cultural and linguistic value of Gaelic in fishing that up until that point they hadn't.
Yeah, and it was during that process, I think, of making the film that we were filming a lot on the boats, and it was for a short film, as Magnus mentioned. But there was, also an understanding that it was a public discussion that this was, this could tie into. And I suppose creative documentary film offers an opportunity to engage in a wider public discussion. And that's, where the feature film, which was sort of, always something that we were developing and considering, came to being. And I think it was at that point as well that not only the current situation was what we were trying to explain in the short film, but also the historical impact and the historical the presence of the past, if you want, in the islands and in the fishing, was something that creatively we were looking to explore. And it really started, I mean, from myself as a filmmaker, seeing, seeing the history, and just even in the boats in the sea, and understanding that the stories that were tied to them and the people and the places were, inherently invisible, but the creative documentary maybe offered an opportunity to explore them, and to keep these kind of underpinning issues around the relationship between, and the importance of the relationship between Gaelic and fishing. And it was not the discovery for me, but the existence of the archive in the School of Scottish Studies. The School of Scottish Studies archives is at the University of Edinburgh, and that's the almost all the material that you heard in the film was from this archive. And there's also some from the Cana House archives, which are held on the island of Cana, but they're actually administered and looked after by the School of Scottish Studies as well. So it was really thanks to some pretty remarkable work that's been happening for the last 10 or 15 years in the School of Scottish Studies to digitalise and to prepare and to categorise a good chunk of these archives, that the film was able to emerge. I don't know, you obviously are at the University of Edinburgh. I don't know if you can explain a little bit more about the archive itself and the underpinning work that I suppose went into recording it originally, which is 70 years ago, but also especially the digitalisation process, because that has been a quite a remarkable project at the university.
Yeah, I mean, I can't claim to be an expert on the history of the School of Scottish Studies archive, and there's people who know a lot more about it than me. But I mean, my understanding is that in its initial years, it was kind of very much modelling what had happened in Ireland, right? So, in Ireland, in the first half of the 20th century, there was this realization about the value of what's sometimes called kind of folk life, in which researchers were sent out to record all elements of life, basically, everything from songs to stories to material culture, how people did things and so on. And that was a very kind of fruitful and successful project, and inspired by that, and to a certain extent funded by that, people in Scotland started to engage in a similar process of actually proactively going out and recording people. So someone like Callum MacLean, Sorley MacLean's brother, was a great inexhaustible kind of recorder of these aspects of, I mean, he was particularly interested in Gaelic culture, but it wasn't just Scotland's Gaelic culture. There were researchers going, to every corner of Scotland, to the rural areas, to the cities, recording things in Scots, in Gaelic, and so on. And that archive just kind of grew and grew. But as is often the case with archives, no matter how amazing the material they hold within them, they're often kind of overlooked, or they're not always as accessible as they might be. So over the past few years, there's been attempts by the University of Edinburgh to really kind of rejuvenate the School of Scottish Studies archive. So it was the building it's in was kind of refurbished. Part of that was a connected aspect of that was the Tobin and Dulcus website that you mentioned, which makes available a lot of those resources online once they've been digitized. That's certainly not all of the archive. There's a lot more of the archive than that, but it's all part of making this archive more accessible and more central to Scottish public life, both in terms of creative industries. So this film is an example of that, of what can be done with that archive. But there's also musicians who've used it, people interested in dance who've used it, people interested in creative writing. So it's part of this attempt to really get people to look at the riches that are in there. And that's a kind of ongoing process, but it's really incredible to see the material that's in there. And I think it's also, I mean, sometimes I think people think of archives and they think it's all about the past. It's all about backward looking. This is the realm of historians, because these were recorded in, the 50s and 60s and so on. But I think one thing that hopefully these films taken together do is show that they very much have a relevance for how we understand Scotland today and how we understand the future. So the feature-length film Iorram is rooted in this archive, but you can't really understand the contemporary situation. You can't understand why fishermen care about the sea or care about the Gaelic language without understanding how it's rooted in that past that the archives give us access to. And I think that the film gives a taste of.
Yeah, I think so as well, and that was also what drew us to that as a mechanism and as a creative way to kind of explore these issues, and it brings us around to today, because obviously the film, it's no accident that the film is getting released at the moment, and there is a contemporary debate, and for those of you that are interested in reading a bit more, there is an article that Magnus and myself have co-authored in the conversation, that will explain a little bit more in relation to the contemporary fishing issues, because this is being released at a time when Scottish fishing is on the front pages, and I suppose it provides a really interesting example of understanding the importance of history and the extensive history, and what is at stake when we talk about Scottish fishing is far beyond the numbers that we sort of see in the headlines.
I think that's true, and I think it's, that's applicable not just in the context of Gaelic speaking areas, but all around Scotland. There's England, Wales, Ireland too. There's inshore fishermen who are working in a similar way, in a sustainable, small scale way. But as I mentioned previously, when the media talk about fishing, that's not necessarily the image they put forward. So I think it ties into the current debate about Scottish fishing, about environmental issues, about whether Scottish fishing will be controlled from Holyrood or from Westminster. But it also ties into a fierce debate about the future of Gaelic in Scotland. So some of you may be aware that, a recent study has highlighted the dramatic decline in Gaelic in the kind of traditional Gaelic speaking communities of the Outer Hebrides. And this caused a bit of I suppose, a questioning of the success story that's often told about the overall number of Gaelic speakers, and made the point that, this increase in speakers is often boosted by people in Edinburgh and Glasgow, learning Gaelic later in life, or Gaelic medium schools. And I think, without wanting to sit on the fence too much, these aren't mutually exclusive, right? I think Gaelic needs to be supported and sustained in traditionally Gaelic speaking communities, but that doesn't mean that it can't also be fostered in the cities and among adult speakers. But I think that one thing this film does is really show the richness and the vibrancy of what the Gaelic language and Gaelic culture has to offer. But I think it ties into those two debates, and again, it points out that these two debates aren't in complete isolation from one another, that actually they are connected.
Yeah, definitely. And it's part of, the anomaly of the film being the first ever fully Gaelic cinema documentary wasn't something we set out to do, but also something that we discovered in it, like in cinema itself as a cultural place, it's a cultural entity, and for the language to be part of that, we think is important, and while it wasn't the intention of the film to necessarily do that, we're really happy it has taken that place, and we'll get seen in the islands and on BBC Alba and in cinemas hopefully across the UK. So yeah, so in that sense, thank you for joining us. Thanks, Magnus, and thanks for those of you who have watched. You can find out more information on the film's website, iorramfilm.com, and there's also information about the research underpinning the project and the short film that we've been discussing. And please share the film if you've liked it, and tell your friends. And otherwise, thanks a lot.